in over 3 years.
Wow.
We shut down March 11th, was the second Wednesday, March 2020, and I feel like we're rebuilding. And I run this other project, as you recall, Armory, Art Deco in the alley, Art in the Alley, and we shut down the last newspaper in Delray. They went out of business. We were on the front page. So we're now calling it Renaissance in the Alley, the rebirth of creativity. Because everything's just starting over. Why am I wearing a mask? Linda Stabile on our board of directors got COVID. So I'm a little nervous. So forgive me, but I'm going to keep the mask on today. It is wonderful. We have Ryan Warren in the house on video. We have a guest speaker came up from Miami Beach. No, not the husband. The Miami Design Preservation League, also known as the MDPL, Miami Design Preservation League. And that's really how I got started. You've all heard the story a million times with Barbara Bayer Caffeton, who discovered the Art Deco modern sculpture in Miami. So you have two papers on your seat, maybe. One, of course, says things to look for in Art Deco architecture, which are all experts already, and a membership application. We'd love to have a membership. It's only $35. I've never raised it in a very long time. 2 for $60. We really do appreciate it. We appreciate the donation, even though it's a free lecture. You're not obligated. Education is what's important to me, and preservation. Education and preservation. So, what are we here for today? We're having a World Congress. What the heck is that? It started 30 years ago in Miami with Barbara Caffeton. I was there. I'm in Florida 37 years from Brooklyn, New York. And she said, Sharon Cascott, you will start the Art Deco Society in the Palm Beaches. Of course, the rest is history. But because of that, she said, well, let's get all these Art Deco societies from all over the world together and meet. And they all came to Miami, and they had people from Australia and California and from all over the world. And she said, let's every 2 years, let's meet all over the world. So of course it costs a lot of money. I went a few times. I went to New York. I went to Cuba, Havana. You've seen the lecture. I went to Paris and Perpignan. I've been to Egypt. I've been Buenos Aires right before COVID was the last World Congress. It was scheduled in 2021 to go to Singapore. Canceled. So there has not been a World Congress since, it was actually 2019. 2019 November was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And now it's coming to Palm Beach County and Miami Beach. Jack Jackson's coming up here to tell you all about it. Next Wednesday, second Wednesday of March, I'll be speaking, showing you the Palm Beach County portion. Okay, but Jack is here to talk about, we're here to talk about the whole thing. Just get everybody all excited that people will come from all over the world to see the Art Deco in Miami, in Central Florida, and the Palm Beaches. Any questions so far? Okay, with that, we're going to have Jack. I met Jack in Buenos Aires. He's from Miami. I had to meet him in Buenos Aires. And we became friends. For those of you who came on the last bus trip, it was 2020, January. And Jack joined us for lunch at the Turkish restaurant. Mm-hmm. And, we made a presentation to the board. It's called ICADS, International Coalition of Art Deco Societies, to hold the 16th World Congress on ArtDeco.com. We were accepted, and we've been working on this for 2 years. Mm-hmm. I can't believe it's 2023, no, I can't believe it's February. Can't believe it's Art Deco second Wednesday. Mm-hmm. But we have been working on this And they're coming April 28th, 29th, and 30th to the Palm Beaches. Now, we have a volunteer committee. Some of you are on that. We've been meeting in Boynton Beach at the Panera Bread because we're going to need all kinds of help. And if you'd like to do that, just send me an email. I'd love to be on that committee, and that would be great. And I thank those of you who are here on the committee. It is a volunteer. And anyway, Jack is this great guy. He knows everything. He's the chairman of the board of the Miami Design Preservation League. Daniel Serraldo, who's the executive director, could not be here tonight. We will mention his name. And with that, I give you Jack Johnson.
Thank you, Sharon. So I have a three-part lecture for you tonight. I'm going to first talk about why is it that Art Deco architecture in South Florida is different from Art Deco architecture in other cities around the world. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is how is it that Miami Beach became the first city in the world to have an Art Deco preservation movement. And then I'm going to talk about the World Congress on Art Deco, which is the main reason why I'm here. First, why is Art Deco architecture in South Florida different? Well, in the early 20th century, Los Angeles was becoming the film capital of the world. New York was becoming the economic capital of the world. Chicago was booming because of the Erie Canal. Detroit was becoming the center of automobile manufacture. Tulsa was growing because of the oil industry. Seattle was becoming a major trade center with Asia, as was San Francisco, which of course had already had its gold rush. And Miami Beach was a swamp. There were less than 50 people living in Miami Beach at the turn of the 20th century. There were fewer than 500 people living in Miami. Today it's a metropolitan area of 2.5 million people. But at the time, everything was small. Everything was built by chance. What we call vernacular architecture. It was built by the people who were going to use it. The city of Miami Beach wasn't incorporated until 1915. The first roads were built in 1913. The first causeway between Miami and Miami Beach was built in 1919. The population grew from 644 in 1920, this is the population of Miami Beach, to about 15,000 in 1925. So a period of 5 years. The predominant architectural style in Miami Beach was the Mediterranean Revival style. You have a lot of that here in Palm Beach County. In fact, there's a lot of it throughout South Florida. Throughout the United States, for that matter. It had been popularized by various international expositions. But then, in 1926, a major hurricane struck directly South Beach. And destroyed much of what had been built up to that time, because the construction wasn't all that great. That hurricane, if it were to strike today, would be considered a Category 4 hurricane. So it was really powerful, and it did strike directly on South Beach. It brought the Depression to Miami Beach early. But Miami Beach also recovered from the Depression early. And the reason for that was tourism. Between 1930 and 1940, the population of Miami Beach doubled to 28,000 people. Miami Beach had annual visitors of 75,000 people by that time, by 1940. So there was a lot of rebuilding being done in Miami Beach and throughout South Florida in the 1930s, in particular the late 1930s. Well, all those other cities that I mentioned were building Art Deco buildings in the 20th century. I mean in the 1920s. So buildings like Rockefeller Center, like the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. Those were built at a time when Art Deco was much more decorative, much more elaborate style. Whereas in Miami Beach, it was a much simpler architectural style, because by the late 30s, the architecture had become less decorative, more geometric, more streamlined. So let's take a look at some of those, some of the buildings in Miami Beach that you'll be seeing if you come to see us for the World Congress. These are, the first ones I'm going to show you are all Ocean Drive hotels. As you look at them, what is similar about all these hotels? Pardon me?
Flat roofs.
Flat roofs, yes. What else?
In that line.
Not that paper.
Eyebrows, yes. Yeah. What about the streamlined? Absolutely.
Windows.
Yes. Geometric, yes.
Looks like a
What about the form of the buildings? They're all 2 or 3 story buildings. They're human-sized buildings rather than skyscrapers. So the same is true of many of the Art Deco buildings here in the Palm Beaches and elsewhere in South Florida. So that's one of the things that makes Art Deco architecture in South Florida unique. Also, these buildings were built primarily by relatively small investors. These weren't, these weren't built by chain hotels. None of them were built by Hilton or Marriott or any of those other companies. They were built by relatively small investors who saw an opportunity to make money off of the booming tourism in Miami Beach. And so they would build these small hotels. The average size of a hotel at the time was only about 50 rooms. And in addition to that, the decorative elements of these hotels tended to reflect the weather, the climate here. We call it tropical deco, and the seaside nature of Miami Beach and similar communities. And the apartment buildings that were built behind those hotels, that is to say toward the west, also tended to be more human scale. 2 or 3 stories. geometric in form, quite beautiful, but nonetheless relatively simple. And here you see how the decorative elements in these buildings tended to reflect the seaside nature of Miami Beach. This beautiful carved concrete element beside the entrance to this building depicts underwater scenes. There are fish in there and seaweed. It's quite unique. The same building has this wave pattern along the top of the parapet. I presume you all know what a parapet is, but maybe you don't. The parapet is the extension of the wall above the roof line of the building. The wave pattern is very common in Miami Beach architecture. Here are more examples. Here's another Miami Beach building, which is more likely to be similar to buildings in other cities, at least in the outlying neighborhoods of those cities. You wouldn't find this in a downtown area, but notice that it's commercial on the ground floor, residential above, and a lot of detailing. This particular notice the zigzag patterns, for instance, very common on Art Deco architecture, and also notice the elaborate decorative element, which at the same time is both tropical and suggestive of a frozen fountain. Another very common element in Art Deco architecture everywhere. Even our theaters are small by comparison to theaters in the rest of the country, but nonetheless beautifully decorated inside and out. And our commercial buildings along Lincoln Road also reflect the same kind of geometry, perhaps a little more elaborate, because they are commercial buildings after all, and they have to attract people. So they are typically, the commercial buildings are typically more decorative than the hotels and the residential buildings. Later on, Lincoln Road was made into a pedestrian mall by the famous architect Lapidus. And we'll talk a little bit more about him later. But the buildings along Lincoln Road are still largely Art Deco buildings. We also had a library in Miami Beach, which is now the home of the Bass Museum, but originally built as a library and built in 1930, and therefore more reflective of the detailing that you see in other early 1930s buildings. Note, for instance, these seagulls in the corners of the building. Quite unique, and again, reflective of the past that we're talking about the seaside, after all. So now, let's move on to my second topic. How is it that Miami Beach became the first city in the world to have an Art Deco preservation movement? Well, after World War II, tourism moved to Middle Beach. New hotels began to be built in the mid-century modern style, what we in Miami call MIMO, or Miami Modern. Much larger, more sophisticated, more all-service kinds of hotels began to be built in Mid-Beach. Hotels like the Eden Rock and the Fontainebleau, both of which were designed by Lapidus, but there were many others as well, designed by other architects. These small buildings in South Beach began to deteriorate. They weren't profitable anymore. They became homes. They became very, very cheap housing, affordable housing before we had the term affordable housing, but very affordable, very cheap. And many of the people who lived there were Jewish. Some were Holocaust survivors. And the buildings, the building owners were not making a whole lot of money off of those buildings, and so they weren't keeping them up. And the buildings began to deteriorate. Then along came a woman by the name of Barbara Bayer Capitman. Barbara moved to Miami Beach along with her husband, William, in 1973. They moved from Westchester County, New York. Barbara was a graphic artist. William was an economist and a market researcher. They hadn't been here 2 years before William died in 1975. And Barbara was looking for something to do with her time and her energies. She met Leonard Horowitz, an interior designer and an openly gay man. He had, because of his profession, an interior designer, he had an appreciation for the architecture of the buildings in Miami Beach. And so he took Barbara on a walking tour. And she immediately fell in love with the architecture. But she also was very interested in the people who were living in those buildings. She and